The Walking Dead-style zombies may not exist in real life, but there are certain parasites that can create zombified versions of grasshoppers, frogs, deer, and even humans. So keep watching for some real-life zombies found in nature. Zombie deer are quite terrifying, especially if you enjoy a nice venison steak once in a while. Chronic wasting disease, also known as zombie deer disease, affects deer, elk, moose, and reindeer. Yes, it's true, even Santa's helpers aren't immune to this affliction. Infected deer will stagger around, drool, stare vacantly into space, and lose large amounts of weight before eventually dying. This disease has been around since 1967, and as of 2021, it's been reported in 25 states, as well as Canada, Norway, Finland, and South Korea. Like mad cow disease, chronic wasting disease is caused by prions, which are infectious proteins that are passed throughout the deer population in bodily fluids like saliva and urine. There have never been any reported human infections, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, it's probably a bad idea to eat infected deer or elk meat. So if you're into hunting, avoid the deer that look like they're obviously not well. If you live in an area where infected deer have been reported, you may be able to have your venison tested to see if it's safe to eat.
Until we find a silver bullet, we just want to control the spread of the disease to the best of our ability.
Human zombies aren't usually known for being particularly alluring, with maybe a few exceptions.
It's funny, you feel warmer than I remember.
But in nature, zombie diseases are rather innovative, and one that infects frogs appears to spread by making its victims more attractive to the opposite sex. Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis is a fungus that is so deadly that it's reportedly caused hundreds of amphibian species to become extinct. Furthermore, it may threaten up to 1/3 of all the world's frogs and salamanders and other amphibians as well. Victims die after the fungus destroys the skin and immune system and eventually causes heart failure. Some species have developed a tolerance to the fungus, though, in particular the Japanese tree frog. And weirdly enough, the infection appears to make males more attractive to females. A 2011 study found that infected frogs had a different mating call than healthy frogs did, one that was faster and longer than those of uninfected frogs. So when they breed, the infected males pass along the fungus as well as the genes that appear to make the frogs more susceptible to infection. Essentially, this fungus is creating hordes of zombie frog minions that are absolutely irresistible to lady frogs. A parasitic microscopic barnacle called Laxothylacis pinopii is known for infecting a small crustacean called the white-fingered mudcrab. This barnacle is an invasive species, as it was brought to the East Coast with oysters from the Gulf of Mexico during a Chesapeake Bay oyster shortage in the 1960s. Female barnacles take over the nervous and reproductive systems of both male and female mud crabs, depositing their larvae in a sac under the crab's abdomen. The infected crabs become infertile, and they're also compelled to protect the parasite's larvae exactly as they would their own offspring. This even happens to the males, who become feminized as the larvae grow. So it's kind of like if you raised a corpse and then turned it into a surrogate parent for your creepy offspring. White-fingered mud crabs aren't especially important to humans. They're a small species, so they aren't ever going to show up on the menu of your favorite seafood place. But in the Chesapeake Bay, up to 90% of white-fingered mud crabs are zombified. And in the event of a population crash, the larger species that depend on them for food, such as birds, fish, and other crustaceans, could be at risk. So zombified mud crabs are indeed something to worry about.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
The jungles of South America are filled with all kinds of terrors, and we're not just talking about the booby traps that Indiana Jones has to escape from. They're also home to the zombie ant, which is infected by a fungus called Ophiocordyceps. Infected carpenter ants leave the colony and stagger around for a while, and then when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, they'll orient themselves in a north-northwest position and bite down on the main vein of a leaf that's approximately 10 inches above the ground. At this point, the ant's jaws have atrophied, which causes it to lock down on the leaf, where it remains until it dies. A giant stalk of fungus then grows from the ant's head and rains spores onto the forest floor, where more ants pick them up and repeat the deadly cycle. Scientists think that the wandering ant phenomenon is an important reason for the success of the fungus, since ants that die outside the colony are much more effective spore-raining devices than those that die inside the colony. Ants always remove the dead from their living spaces before the fungal stalk would have time to grow. You might feel safe in believing that there aren't many zombie diseases that affect human beings, but be prepared to have your false sense of security shattered. One particular disease doesn't cause brain eating or decomposition, but the symptoms are nonetheless pretty terrifying. It's called African trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, and it's spread by the tsetse fly. At first, the symptoms, like headaches and muscle aches, are a lot like those of other illnesses, but then the infected develop irritability, difficult concentrating, and slurred speech, followed by loss of appetite. They stop sleeping at night and become excessively tired during the day. Eventually, they lose the ability to perform simple tasks and lapse into a zombie-like state before finally slipping into a coma and eventually dying. Some manage to survive, but their brains are usually irreversibly damaged. So if you're planning to travel to certain parts of Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo in particular, be prepared. There's no vaccine, and survivors don't develop immunity. There are drugs available to treat the illness, but they aren't widely available around the continent, and they're not considered a cure. Furthermore, patients can relapse up to 2 years after infection. Zombies are forever staggering into sharp objects, becoming incapacitated by mud or walking off cliffs. They're terrifying, but it's not especially difficult to outsmart them, as they tend to be remarkably incapable of self-preservation. Some real-life zombies are like that as well. The amber snail, for example, gets infected by a parasite known as the green-banded broodsac because it gets tricked into eating the parasite's eggs while it's scavenging the excrement of the local bird population. The eggs incubate inside the snail, and then they hatch and infect the digestive gland. The juvenile parasites grow inside long tubes, which stretch until they fill the snail's tentacles. The tube-filled tentacle enlarges and then pulsates in vivid colors, which to certain creatures is basically like a neon sign flashing the message, "Come eat me." Birds then see the colorful display and swoop down for a snack. The worms continue to develop inside the bird's gut, eventually laying eggs that get pooped out, and the cycle begins all over again. So basically, the parasite turns the snail into an instrument of its own demise. You may have heard of parasitic birds like the cuckoo, which leaves its eggs in other species' nests. Some insects do the same thing, except the process is much more insidious and horrifying. A wasp called Glyptopantala lays its eggs in the body of a caterpillar. The eggs then hatch, and the larvae feeds on the caterpillar's bodily fluids until they're ready to eat through the body of their host and enter the cocoon stage on a nearby twig or leaf. But they're not done with the poor caterpillar yet, which has somehow survived this whole process. Instead of crawling off to die, the caterpillar stands guard over the cocoons. And like any good zombie, it will actually lash out violently at anything that comes near its creepy offspring. Then it conveniently dies right around the time that the young wasps emerge from their cocoons. Nobody really knows how the parasite manages to turn the animal it's killing into a devoted bodyguard, which kinda makes it that much more terrifying. Thus far, none of the natural zombie phenomenon have involved decomposition, but nature even has its own version of that process. It's called necrosis, which according to Science Daily is defined as the unprogrammed death of cells and living tissue. The unprogrammed part of that definition is key. In programmed cell death, the immune system cleans up cell debris, but when there's necrosis, the immune system doesn't receive the signals that tell it that there are dead cells that need to be eliminated. So a person who has necrosis is basically decomposing while still alive. Necrosis can happen after an injury when there's limited blood supply to the injured area or when there's a bacterial infection. The venom of some spiders, like brown recluse, can also cause necrosis. Before you decide to never leave your house again due to this threat, it's worth noting a couple of things about necrosis. It's typically localized, at least at first, so it can be treated and the spread can be halted well before you're infected enough to join the ranks of the living dead. And the particularly scary bacterial version, known as necrotizing fasciitis, is very uncommon. Most experts estimate that it affects somewhere between 1 and 5 per 100,000 people, although those numbers don't take into account all the bacteria that can cause necrotizing fasciitis. Overall, it's not a huge risk, so don't let it keep you up at night. The insect world seems to contain the majority of real-life zombies, and not every zombie victim will go down without a fight. The jewel wasp, for example, turns cockroaches into zombies, and the process is quite horrific. The female wasp stings the cockroach twice. First, it paralyzes the roach's front legs, then it delivers venom directly to its brain. The second sting makes the roach complacent so that it's only able to walk if it's being led by the wasp. From this point, the roach's attacker leads it around like the world's most unfortunate dog, lays an egg on it, and buries it alive. You can probably guess what happens next. The egg hatches, and then the larva burrows into the cockroach's body, eats it from the inside out, and then emerges from its dead host. A healthy roach would dig itself out of this grave, but the zombified roaches don't even try. Sometimes, though, the roaches will fight back against the wasp's initial attack. In a laboratory setting, some roaches were able to fend off the wasp for up to 3 minutes, as reported by Science Daily. Scientists surmise that in the wild, that would probably be enough to convince the wasp to look for another victim. If you were a zombie yourself, you might just be praying for death. or the death that follows death, as it were. Faced with the prospect of either jumping into a lake or eating raw human brains and having your body parts randomly fall off as you decompose, what would you do? For zombified grasshoppers, the answer is simple. It might not sound too great, but it beats the alternative. The nematomorph hairworm is a parasite that infects grasshoppers and crickets. The adult hairworm is aquatic, which presents it with a slight problem because grasshoppers and crickets are not water residents. But it solves this problem by essentially brainwashing its unwitting host into drowning itself. After a hairworm matures, it needs to swim away and find a mate. But first, it needs to get its host into the water, and it does this by producing proteins that affect the grasshopper's central nervous system. The proteins change the grasshopper's response to water, which ultimately makes it more likely to jump into a large pond, swimming pool, or whatever water-filled environment happens to be nearby. Then the worm leaves the host and lives happily ever after. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more messed up history videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.